welcome to another episode of the Relationship Toolbox, a show about building skills for positive relationships with others. Today our topic is going to be defensive behavior. By this we mean what kind of behaviors, what kind of situations start defensiveness within ourselves. How can we deal with that when we sense we are in that defensive mode? How can we respond to others if we sense that they are in the defensive mode? So let's start out today with talking a little bit about what is defensiveness? What are we talking about, Marsha?
Well, it's easy to kind of run a parallel to what we see in sports because you can get your head wrapped around that. And you'll often see signs with spectators, not unlike the one that we have here with defense. And believe it or not, when I was in 8th and 9th grade, a cheerleader, and that was
Really?
part of our, I know.
Me too,
Those days are over. But we, defense, pushing back, shoving back. It was about keeping that line and blocking the other team from being able to penetrate your line and score. So it's a big strategy in sports. But it's also a strategy that we use when we perceive that somebody is either portraying or treating us in a way that makes us feel vulnerable or threatened. And so we call on our own defense mechanisms to kind of block them from getting to the places that we feel vulnerable in.
And that can take us right into that conflict cycle,
yeah,
right?
that we've been talking about, where you've got a triggering event and then you act on it and you have thoughts and emotions and feelings. And if you get sucked into that, or if you play into that, probably it's not going to be a productive experience, and you're going to be drawn into the conflict. You're going to end up angry or hurt or resentful or disappointed, and quite often isolated from the very person that you care about because you're trying to protect yourself by...
That's a really good point. You end up feeling isolated.
Isolated, because sometimes that's the only way out in the end. Because we want to defend ourselves from those threats and vulnerabilities at any cost sometimes.
It's a form of protection, and so when we're protecting ourselves and putting that wall up, that's automatically keeping others out, and that's what leads to that isolation. I love that.
Yeah. So what creates the behavior?
Well, if you're thinking about yourself and you think about things that create defensive behavior in yourself, and again, that's a perception of a threat, right? It's not necessarily a real threat that you need to be in fight or flight mode, but you're perceiving it as a threat, and that's an important part, so that if we're under attack, we need to protect ourselves, right? So some of the ways that we might do this, for example, if I'm feeling judged or criticized, maybe someone says to me, oh, Traci, you're so sensitive about that. That might automatically kick my defensiveness in gear, right?
What's wrong with being sensitive?
Right. Or I might feel like I'm not sensitive. I might defend the fact that maybe I'm not sensitive. No, I'm not. I'm not sensitive. What are you talking about?
As soon as you label somebody, you can engender that sense of threat and vulnerability.
Right.
Labeling can kick that button, yes.
Absolutely. And another example of that is, maybe if I'm feeling ignored or discounted, maybe someone walks by me at work and they don't say hello. And it makes me wonder, and I think, oh gosh, they don't like me, or what did I do, or something along those lines.
What's that about?
You see that
I might start with self-blame.
You see that with kids a lot too, because they quickly go to that assumption, that what's wrong with me? What have I done?
Yes, and then once I start going down that slippery slope, I'm in self-blame, and then I start to defend myself because I feel bad about myself.
Or you feel inadequate, or you feel like you don't belong,
right?
or
I'm not
you've done
worthy,
something wrong,
or something.
It's like a self-fulfilling cycle.
It is, exactly, yeah. So other ways that might happen, if there's some unfair expectations or demands that I feel like are on me. So let's say I'm a parent, and I'm a stay-at-home parent, and I for some reason have that expectation, or think others perceive the expectation of me to clean the house also, as well as taking care of the kids and doing what I'm doing that day. It's my role to take care of the house because I might be home. And if someone comes in and says, oh, you didn't take the garbage out, I might automatically get defensive because I might think, well, I was busy doing other things, I was taking care of them, or I took them to the doctor, or whatever it is that I was doing, but I would kind of automatically maybe get a bit defensive there.
Sure.
Particularly if it's building on previous conflicts. Just one word can reference back.
Right.
Maybe, maybe it's not intended, but it kind of is tender, and you get prickly about it.
Right. And that's the key thing again, is that's my perception of something being offensive or attacking, or, they may not have intended it that way at all. Right. But for me, it triggers that, and that might come from prior. Yes. Yeah. And it might come from prior conflict. It might, I'm not sure where it comes from. So another possibility is just assuming the possible loss of someone's affection. So if I go and I reach out to hold your hand and you pull your hand away for some reason, right? So I might automatically think, oh my gosh, again, what did I do wrong? Why is that person pulling their hand away from me? Potentially they don't love me anymore. All kinds of defensive things can kind of kick in with that. Sometimes, you might think about work or a loss of a relationship or employment. Let's say I am at work and someone says to me, so-and-so said something about you to someone else. And then I think to myself, oh my gosh, but that's not true. I didn't do that, or I didn't say that, or I didn't think that. And then I automatically get defensive because I have a perceived threat of maybe losing my job or looking like a bad employee. And that makes me defensive automatically. And the last thing I just, wanted to think about is maybe like a loss of status. So if someone is kind of challenging something that I wrote, maybe I wrote something at work and someone is challenging it and asking whether it's accurate, or maybe they're, pointing out all the typos in it, something along those lines, I might get defensive instead of them pointing out. I might prefer them to point out what was good about it, but instead they're doing that, and that might trigger my defensive-ness as well.
Sure.
I know that when you talk about loss of status, sometimes it's even social in the friendship hierarchy with kids and students, but even adults. Somebody moves into town and can usurp your position in that best friend triangle, and it can be really hard. And I see it with kids all the time in terms of you feel like you've been demoted and you don't feel as easy. I think so much of this has to do with our identities.
Without question.
Of who we are.
And how solid we are with that.
Well, how solid, and no matter who you are, you have parts of yourself that you want to protect, that you don't want to reveal, that you're not really proud of. Or you deviate from who you think you are, and somebody points it out, and that's like, if you think you're really an organized person, and then there's a time when you're not, but you don't want to concede that maybe you messed up, or that you weren't organized, because it doesn't fit with your image of who you are. And so in order to protect yourself, you get defensive, you counterattack, or if somebody says you're not a good parent, that would be my button. If somebody had said, they can call me a lot of things, but I've right or wrong, from my perception, I really worked hard to be a good parent. So that was my soft white underbelly. If somebody attacked that would be my trigger. That would be the part where I would feel defensive and either retreat or try to persuade them in whatever way that they were wrong, that they couldn't possibly.
I am the best parent.
Yeah, well, maybe not the best, but that would be my vulnerability, my threatening place. But I think there's a survival. There's a very visceral, physical connection to this, and so that's sometimes why we react and get physical.
Right into our next part about. How do I know when I'm in defensive
Wow.
Most of us, just as you said, it's a very visceral thing. So that usually we feel it in our gut first with it. So, and for the sake of just understanding this, we sort of divided these feelings into hard feelings and soft feelings. Hard feelings being those which were a little bit more willing to reveal, such as I'm angry about this, I'm frustrated, I resent you doing this, I'm surprised or maybe disbelief with it. The softer emotions are the ones that were more vulnerable to what you talked about before. And these are the things that we really want to protect ourselves from. And they're more like I'm hurt, I'm embarrassed, I feel guilty because it doesn't fit the picture of myself and you've caught me in it. I'm humiliated, I'm fearful, I'm exposed, and I'm vulnerable. So those are the feelings that we call the soft ones that we're most likely to try to protect as well with it. Another part of recognizing when we're in a defensive mode is our thinking pattern. And this usually is something that we express. So let's do a couple of these that are some of these that we know are pretty typical reactions in thinking. How dare you?
That's not true, and you know it.
You think you're so much better than everyone else.
You know you do the same thing.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Anyone who knows me would understand that's not like me at all.
That's so unfair.
You're such a control freak.
You're such a narcissist.
These are things, of course, if we actually, these are things we're thinking perhaps, and if we dare to actually express them in those words, that usually can counter, and we're in the cycle then. Then we're going to counter and get some defensive behavior from the other person.
Because it's not about me, it's about you. It's like that counterattack.
Yes.
It's like, don't look over here, look over here.
I just feel attacked, so I'm going to attack you.
I'm going to throw it back at you.
Right. And now talking about what kind of behaviors are typical when we feel in the defensive posture, and aggression is one of them. I feel threatened, I'm going to get you back with it. Loud voice is usually something that occurs. Tense eyes, or maybe the face getting very flush or red with
fists,
it.
Sometimes tense hands.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tense hands. Sometimes very dramatic gestures. How could you think that, and so forth with it. Denial. And I know that's one that would catch me a lot, that my denial would come in the form of arguing, you know.
Persuading.
Persuading,
yes. Let me tell you why you're wrong.
Let me show you how that's not true.
It's like, okay.
Another one that's common is name calling. And another one that's really occurring on the horizon now is diagnosing. We hear psychological terms so much that it's easy. Yeah, the narcissist is one, with it. Pointing finger, pounding fist, those are ones of showing the agitation. Sometimes, though, it flips the other way, and someone gets very quiet, saying nothing or maybe even crying. So these would be behaviors that within ourselves, that when we feel those things and start to act in that way, we know, oops, I just got tripped, you know, in my emotional buttons with it. So I need to start dealing with my own defensive behavior and feelings. So why don't we go on to that, Traci?
Well,
how do we do it?
I just want to remark when you were making those descriptions that, you know, we think that we're so high and mighty and civilized and intellectual, but we're still animals, and we have evolved, but some of our biology hasn't. And when we feel threatened, whether it's social, emotional, or physical, we make ourselves bigger, and we make these gestures.
Yeah, it's a STEM part of the brain.
And our voices get louder, and we try to establish superiority to defend ourselves. So,
and there's a neurological function with that. I mean, people have heard, right? It's fight or flight, maybe freeze, but whatever it is you're doing, you instantly go to that place, and you have to be aware that you're in that place and then make a decision. Do I need to be in this place?
That's right.
So that's
because it's not our most rational place.
No, it's absolutely not our rational place.
That's why we go to name calling, because sometimes that's all we're left with, because we can't think.
And in mediation, oftentimes, if people begin to get into that, we have to get them out of that before they can really begin to problem solve. Marsha, you made a point earlier when we were talking about how we tend to view ourselves differently from others. Could you make that?
We often excuse the same kind of behaviors in ourselves that we point fingers at other people. So, you know, when we get into these conflicts and we're you know, doing counter arguments, we attribute somebody's bad behavior to character flaws in them. But when we do something wrong, it's often for external reasons. You know, I wasn't disorganized for that event. I was, you didn't give me enough time, or the shipment didn't come in. It was always about something that was outside of me. It couldn't possibly be that I was not organized.
There's always a rationale for it.
There's always a reason that is totally understandable. But if it happens, and somebody else is demonstrating that same behavior, then we think, well, they're a loser, they're irresponsible, they don't plan, they don't, and so we we judge ourselves differently than we judge other people. And so we have kind of this self-righteous position of our view of the world is the right view and yours is the flawed. And I can do this because, I mean, I was justified in doing it. But when you did it, it was because you internally are of bad character.
That very phenomena triggers defensive behaviors in the other person with it. So, so Traci, how do we get past that? I mean, these, as you say, are very realistic, very human behaviors and reactions, and they come from physiological processes as well.
Right.
How do we get past them?
That's a great question, Tom. One of the first things we can do is kind of take inventory of ourselves, right? Take a look at yourself. What are your emotional hot buttons? What is it? Like you said, you're parenting. If someone were to say something about that.
As a parent, it's like, oh, my
right,
radar.
Right. So automatically your radar goes up, and people can, you know, notice those physiological things and know that those are that's when they want to say, oh, okay, that's a button for me because I feel this, I literally feel it, and then it starts to build from there.
And I may not be able to hear a really good observation that somebody has to make because I'm so invested in my identity as a parent.
Right, right,
It's like,
right. So that what you want to do then is pay attention to your feelings, pay attention to the physiological aspect, pay attention to what it is you're feeling, pay attention to what your behaviors are when you're being defensive.
And hopefully prior to, I mean, to be aware of that.
Right, right. That's ideal, yes. And sometimes you can catch yourself in the moment, right? Sometimes we do react and say something and do something also. And if you're doing that, just catch yourself if you can and make yourself aware of what you do. If you're thinking of it outside of the moment and you're not in defensive mode, but you take a look and just take stock. Notice things about yourself. And don't blame yourself, just take notice.
Right.
And just look at yourself and say, okay, so when I'm feeling angry, this is what I do. So that you're aware of what your actions are and you're aware of what your behaviors are.
You bring up another good point that you could actually do it after the fact.
Sure.
So if you do something and say, boy, did I ever blow that. I went right into defensive behavior.
Absolutely.
But afterward reflect on it and then take action.
how can I back it up and do better? Slow it down.
Yeah, go back into the same picture and say, hey, I recognize that I did this. You know,
do it
can I
differently
start over? Right.
Next time, can we do it differently?
Right.
Yeah.
I've done that where I've literally asked another person, you know, let's go back. They weren't in the room initially, and I've said, can you go back and start completely over? Go back in the other room, walk back in, and let's start this whole conversation over.
So like the analogy of football again, and do the replay, but this time we can change it. I caught the football
Change the
this
whole
time.
play. Don't just change the call at the end with the referees, but the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah. So other things you can do is just postponing, you know, practice postponing some of these things. So if you feel any of these things happening physiologically, you know you're going to that place where you're going to get defensive, say something. Say, you know, I'm feeling like I'm getting a little defensive, or I feel like I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. Can we have this conversation in a little while? And even giving a time to come back to it is really beneficial.
Because then it's not just avoiding.
Yeah, it's not a fear for then it doesn't create a fear for the other person that it's never going to get talked about.
But it might be when it's more productive.
Right.
You are emotionally flooded and it's not going to be productive. You're just going to go through the old patterns.
Right. And that's not just because you have those patterns. Your brain cannot function well when you're
true.
in that mode. Right. When you're in flood mode, your brain doesn't function the same as when you're not in flood
But
mode.
as you say, it's good to have a specific time because then the other person can be patient and understanding that this is still going to happen.
Right.
We're going to get this resolved. We're going to continue to talk about it, but this is not a productive time.
Right. They're not going to think you're giving up on it or just avoiding
Ignoring or
it.
discounting
Because
them.
that is sometimes a way that people do get defensive as well. They just never address things. They storm out.
Right. Right. Yeah. So having that happen and giving yourself a time to come back to it and letting the other person know is another thing that you can do. Sometimes you do withdraw a little bit, right? So not always a bad thing. Sometimes if you know that about yourself and you need that time, or you notice something in the other person and they're kind of like a dog with a bone and won't let it go, and you feel like there's maybe not a literal tangible safety thing, but it's making you feel really vulnerable, and they're not listening to you say, I need to take a break, maybe you do need to walk away. Maybe you do need to say, I'm coming back to this.
But yeah,
I'll be
that's the
back.
part that you need to add, because we've talked about conflict styles. And if you're in that kind of recessive, accommodating, appeasing place all the time, then it's not going to serve you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or if you go into the competitive stance,
The
which
dog
is
with the bone.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
that's going to
That's
be.
not going to be
Yeah.
right.
But timing's,
Right.
timing's everything.
It is.
sometimes,
It's really
you know?
important. And I think we all feel, I might have said this before, but we all feel that pressure sometimes to get something done, right? We have this time, we're in the moment, it has to be talked about right now. And I don't, you know, people follow people sometimes. That's an automatic thing that triggers defensiveness in people. So having to talk about it right now because it feels like you just have to get this resolved is actually not necessarily beneficial. It seems like it would be beneficial because you're trying to resolve a problem.
Right.
In reality, it's not always beneficial if you're
Trying
not
to feel
in a
better about it as quickly as you can.
yeah, and it doesn't always work. I mean,
Right.
sometimes it might if you're in a good place, but if you're not in a good place and you can't, and you're getting defensive or they're getting defensive, it's better to take a break and come back to it. So that's important too. Sometimes you also want to determine whether it's safe for you to kind of expose those softer feelings that you were talking about. That's a great distinction, the hard feelings and soft feelings. I just think those soft feelings are actually the feelings that we can express to other people that connect us to other people.
If we're willing to.
Yes.
I think sometimes the soft feelings are hiding behind the hard feelings
They
because
are.
we'll express
Absolutely.
anger
Right.
when really we feel fear
Right.
or
hurt.
hurt or humiliation,
Right.
but it comes out as blustery anger.
Right. Anger's so much easier to express for
some
most
people,
people.
yeah.
The other
Right.
thing too is that if you have the courage to do that, and there's no guarantee if you do that, express a soft feeling that the other person's going to respect it. They may attack you
true, too.
again and use it. But if you are able to do that, it does invite people to respond in a similar way.
It also puts you in touch with your feelings,
Yes.
right? So this is really what I'm feeling.
Well, it
That's
brings
so
about
hard.
It's such a good
So hard.
awareness,
It is,
isn't
it's
it?
great.
To know
it
what
invites
you're actually
compassion
feeling.
It's hard
when
to
you
do.
say, I
It
feel
does.
hurt, I feel embarrassed by what I
Absolutely.
did.
Going back.
That
yeah.
invites more compassion
It
for what
does.
I've been through
Right.
than to attack.
Right.
Well, it's kind of an interpretation of the I message. Is you're speaking
Yes.
from this point of view, and you're not attacking the other person when you're saying I feel,
Right.
vulnerable. I feel like I've been rejected. I feel hurt. I feel threatened.
Yes.
Instead
And
of
if you truly feel unsafe in some manner, I just want to clarify, if you truly are feeling unsafe, then that might not be something you want to share with the other
You
person.
don't